Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Before we begin today, just a quick disclaimer. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. With us today we have Kristine E. Pytash, who is an assistant professor in teaching, learning, and curriculum studies at Kent State University's College of Education, Health, and Human Services, where she co-directs the Secondary Integrated Language Arts Teacher Preparation Program. She was a former high school English teacher. Her research focuses on disciplinary writing, the literacy practices of youth and alternative schools, and juvenile detention facilities, and preparing teachers to teach writing. We also have with us W. Ian O'Byrne, who is an assistant professor of educational technologies at the University of New Haven. His research examines the literacy practices of individuals as they read, write, and communicate in online spaces. With that, I'll hand it over to our presenters.
Hi, Justin. Thank you very much. So today we are interested in talking with you about the research on literacy instruction in virtual and blended and hybrid environments. And really the question that is guiding this work is what are the pedagogical practices that foster K-12 students' literacy engagement, learning, and acquisition in virtual, blended, and hybrid school settings?
So one of the challenges that we have in all of this is that these hybrid spaces, these virtual blended learning spaces, we're still trying to figure out what they all mean. We know that our school systems are increasingly pushing students into these environments. It would have been nice if a couple of years ago when we started to see this movement, we had more thought and more research into best practices for these spaces. But we noticed the fact that in open spaces, we see an increased use of these virtual blended spaces. We saw, a movement in higher ed where higher ed universities, either to save cost or space, were pushing students into these spaces. And then now we start to see an influx in K-12. So Kristine and I, we wanted to take a look at what exactly the research said. What are the opportunities that we have for literacy practices, for learning in these spaces. And so one of the things we wanted to first look at is what do we mean by this content? So virtual, blended, or hybrid spaces, the idea is that, we have our face-to-face environment in the classroom, and then we have online learning spaces, so we can use MOOCs, we can use websites, we can use blogs, we can use social networks. And so when we talk about blended or hybrid learning, there really is no secret mixture or secret sauce, at least in my opinion, of what makes up blended or hybrid learning. What we're looking at is a middle ground. So some of our schools, I know my university basically defines moving to totally online as 51%, but there is a middle ground. So what we're doing as educators is trying to find the best mixture of the face-to-face learning and the online learning using digital text and tools to support student learning. So our goal in this was we wanted to take a look at what exactly was happening, what does the research say, and figure out where we should head next. So we're pretty much left with more questions than we had answers at the end of the chapter.
So one of the things that we started to notice when we really kind of dug into the research is that there was a significant amount of research that focused on specific pedagogical strategies, but it was kind of generic in content. So it talked more about things that we know about students learning, such as using communication tools or monitoring their progress or providing feedback. And so Ian and I started to really kind of ask and to look at various pieces of the literature and focusing primarily on literacy. So as we're thinking about the reading and writing practices that students are doing in these various spaces, you know, what are the practices that really foster this engagement in literacy and really help them to kind of become more effective as readers and writers in these spaces? So today, obviously, we're going to be focusing on writing, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about reading. And like Ian said, we have a number of questions that we were left with at the end, thinking about, you know, what are the implications for practice? So as we think about writing instruction in this particular setting, or writing instruction face-to-face, what we really know is that writing is very complex. It requires students to have this knowledge of content, these cognitive abilities, a conceptual knowledge of just the writing process, and then strategies that can help them during the writing process. So writing itself is very complex. And then we know that, you know, writing is also influenced by the learning environment, the relevance to the students in terms of how relevant do they think the writing task is to them, to their lives. And then the influence of writing outcomes. And what I mean by that is simply if a student can think that he or she is a good writer and their dispositions towards writing. And so this is very complex. And we know that it's a very recursive process, so that writers are, you know, going through not just a step-by-step, this is not linear, but it's something that they're doing, you know, as they are brainstorming, they're revising, they are writing, they're drafting, all of these different things are happening at one time. And so what Ian and I were wondering is, what does this really look like when it takes place in online settings? And what do we know about how writers learn to write in these particular settings?
And so the interesting thing is, as Christy said, when we move to these online spaces, we know that environment, we know that the social context definitely affects writing. You know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about a question a colleague asked me a couple of years ago: can we just take the writing process and move it online, and does it still work? And I go back and forth on whether or not it still is a meaningful piece to just add into the online space. One piece that I've started to frame out, and we'll talk about it later, is online content construction. So I think with online content construction, I took the writing process and basically added a couple skills to it. But the challenge is with quote unquote writing online, you know, there are numerous factors that affect what an individual will write, what they can conceive, what they try to share in their writing. You know, we have digital text and tools that modify and in some cases dictate what a student will write and how they will write. We also have the all the visual and digital literacies that go along with, you know, writing. So in many cases, students don't have to worry about just text. They need to incorporate, we urge them to incorporate other multimodal content, you know, add images, add video, add audio, and what are those design aesthetics, what are those different texts and those multimodal texts add to content. So it's a case of students having to have a clear idea of what all this means and then mash it all together and share it. We haven't even talked about remix or mashup culture, but just getting an idea and making sense of it and molding and modifying online content, multimodal content to share information is pretty challenging. And then the other two layers of complexity that we haven't brought in is, the social media layer, and the fact that when you are writing something or in hybrid spaces, it's instantly out there. And then also the fact that it's open and anybody can read it, anybody can access it. So we've been, in other words, Kristine and I and others have been researching how individuals create and share online content, what this does for identity, what this does in social spaces. We're running a MOOC right now, the Walk My World MOOC, that we can share more information about. And we're looking at this. What happens when individuals, pre-service educators, K-12 students, higher ed students, what happens when they just create and write, quote unquote, write content and share it online? So Kristine has a question. Go ahead, Kristine.
No, I was going to say that, technology is changing the way that writing is produced and disseminated. And yeah, Kristine brought up, one of our participants, a great question, about whether the writing process is still worth teaching as opposed to writing strategies. So that is a really important question. What should writing instruction look like? And I agree. I mean, that is a very, that is debated. Should students still be doing brainstorming on Monday and then on Tuesday writing their draft and going through those steps? Or should we be helping students kind of think through this as more of a recursive process? Go ahead, Ian, I interrupted you.
No. And I think part of the challenge with that, and it's an awesome question, Kristine, part of the challenge is also, let's say we really open up our classrooms, and in my mind, I'm talking pre-K up through higher ed. Let's say we really open up classrooms and we empower our students to really write in online hybrid spaces. We allow them to write with, digital text and tools. Then we're opening ourselves up to questions about the writing process. In work that I've done, peer evaluation is definitely a powerful element of it. It allows students to share strategies and share expertise, but also get a critical eye on what's happening and what the student's writing and trying to share. But the other challenge here, I mean, if we really open ourselves up and allow students to write using digital text and tools in hybrid spaces, some of the complexity comes in where some of the students might have expertise that the teacher or the instructor does not. And that's nothing new. We've dealt with that for the last 10, 15 years when we talk about literacy and technology. But then the other key component is, to me, the challenge is how do you assess that? So if you have students that sit in your room and they all write blog posts, or they do a video remix, or they create a YouTube video, or let's say you differentiate instruction and assessment and you allow them to do whatever their little hearts desire, how do you assess the work product that comes back? So it's a challenge. To me, the focus in writing instruction with technology, the real simple way to, sort of bring some consensus to this is, I think that we need to focus on process, not product. I think we need to find ways to sort of pause and stop the student learning and focus on the process and the design choices they make along the way, not really care as much about the product at the end, but what do they do along the way and what decisions do they make along the way? And how can we document that? So one way is to have them journal or blog as they're creating and document design choices along the way.
And Ian's exactly right. I mean, it gets back into when we think about, our next slide talks about purpose, audience, and feedback, that using technology and social media and these various writing platforms allows for students to have a more authentic purpose for writing, which is, again, tied to their audience, so that they can be metacognitive about their writing process, thinking about the decisions that they were making while they were writing, but then also getting feedback on those. And so we know through blogging, just having students comment back and forth, having people, from outside of the classroom commenting back and forth, and then we have writing platforms like Eli Review or Scholar that is designed for very much for making sure students have feedback on their writing in this particular space. I mean, we've seen that.
So,
So Troy Hicks is one of our colleagues, and he has a fantastic book about crafting digital writing. And again, he does talk about these things in his book as well. We had that mentioned from one of our participants.
so one of the powerful things with the purpose audience and feedback is, we need to provide our students with a critical lens to understand what they're saying. I'm a big believer in critical literacy and critical pedagogy, and critical media literacy, and it's having students and ourselves understand that when we put things online, they stay online for the most part. And when we put things online, they might have unintended consequences for other readers, because it's hard to parse out meaning from text, or from this difference between text and multimodal content. But through the intentional use of digital text and tools, we have the opportunity to push pause on student learning. We can make learning and creation a bit asynchronous. And what I mean by that is what I said earlier. Have students regularly blog or journal or tweet during the process. Have them document decisions that they're making. And one of another powerful piece, while we're here still talking about audience and feedback and using these digital text and tools, a really powerful tool that we've used a lot is screencasting. So have students, for my dissertation, I had students create hoax websites. And from the outside, you would look at their website and they'd be interesting, they'd be colorful, and you'd be excited about having, students create, websites and online content. But then as my assessment device, basically I started up a screencasting tool. Screencast-O-Matic works, Camtasia works, all the Apple Mac products all have QuickTime that will record now. But basically have students give you a guided tour of what they've created and ask them to document design choices along the way. And you'll be shocked at how savvy most of them are. And so it brings up bigger questions about where are they getting this media literacy, this savvy use. I wanted to go back to Kristen's question in there about the processes and the tools, and thinking about tool use, and challenges with that. Krista, you want to jump on that one first, or no?
Sure.
What do you think? What do you think about tool use and the different affordances of tools, and students thinking about tool use and how they use those in discussion or in creation?
Well, one of the things that we have been talking about is what does this look like when you work with younger writers? So when you work with students who are in kindergarten, who are in first, second grade, who are still kind of working on not necessarily their writing as in their composing, but they're working on how to word process, how to get better at the keyboarding skills. And this is when, when Ian talks about, in the next slide, we'll talk a bit more about too, reconceptualizing what it is to mean to write and what it means to be a writer, having students be able to have conversation about their writing, to collaborate with their writing. And that's what the research has really pointed back to, especially in those elementary years, to be able to use things like iPads, Twitter, blogs, iMovies, where they're creating and still going through that writing process without necessarily the constraints of just having to keyboard as well. And then Ian, I'll let you.
I think it's an interesting piece, because we want to think about, if for a second, let's ignore our students in the picture. How do we feel about creating online content? And a lot of the research shows that for the most part, we are primarily consumers of online content. In my work, and I know in Christy's work, we try to move people from primarily consuming online content to curating online content. So all of you that use Pinterest and Learnist and those tools, there is something to be said for, and there's great power in reviewing all the online content, and with the more educated, informed eye, selecting all the best from what you see and sharing that. So you might be sharing great screencasting tools, you might be sharing great recipes or great crafts on Etsy, or as my wife, you might be sharing the best fine Italian handbags that you find online. So moving from content consumption to curation to finally construction. I push to see students be web makers. So I do a lot of work with Mozilla and the Web Literacy Initiative, and have people become web makers and start to remix and play with content. But it brings up bigger questions about, do we think that we have the right to or permission to just write things and share them online and remix content and put it online? And I think that more of us, I think that we should believe that we have the right to, and we should do it more often.
And I think that's becoming easier as we do think about how we conceptualize composition. So we think about the various modes that students are using and how they're bringing those things together. And like Ian brought up, we're thinking about this in a very critical way, how we're actually empowering individuals to actually remix these things, to be producers and curators and not just consumers of text. And I think that literacy educators are really thinking about, what does this mean for classroom? What does this mean when students are doing this type of writing in the classroom? But then, as Ian brought up, it can be hard to evaluate, hard to assess without walking them through the process. And what does this mean when we have students who are in the middle of high-stakes testing right now, where they're going to be expected to read and write in very particular ways?
I think there's also the challenge of, for me, most of this work comes down to, so when we talk about teaching and learning or literacy practices in hybrid spaces, we're increasingly using the internet as a text in the classroom. And even saying that, there are challenges in suggesting that the internet is the primary text, for our generation. We're basically stating that it is a dominant force. It is a dominant text that we use in instruction, in socializing, in communicating. So one of the first things that I suggest is that we expand our notion of text. We expand text to mean other things than print or traditional text. We include all that great multimodal content. For me, my version of text is very broad. I see text as being street signs and advertising and videos and the little Lego figures that my son plays with. I see text as being, graphics and animated GIFs and also audiobooks. So it calls into question, what do we consider to be text in our classroom, and what's appropriate and what's acceptable forms of text? And then that begs the question, well, what are acceptable ways for our students to write and to share? So that's one of the key components. So if we have students, and we'll get to reading in a minute, but if we have students writing and they're creating videos or they're creating a blog post, is that as important or as valued in our eyes as instructors? Is that it as valued of an assessment as much as a 5-paragraph essay? Is that as valued as a journal post or when they stand up and give a speech? So it really challenges our notions of text and what we accept in our classroom. And I love the idea of remix. We live in a remix and mashup culture. There's so many fun things that we can do in our classroom with remix and mashup. It's just starting off with letting our students play with digital text.
Yeah, and I would love to hear from our participants to see what they think and how writing is being done in their classrooms as well, and the challenges that they have in their classrooms. I think Kristine is about ready to maybe give us a question.
And now the ever popular multiple attendees are all typing at once. I mean, this is the fun part. We can really do great question. Yeah, so I mean, with that's one of the challenges. I'm a big believer. So the question that Kristine has, the idea of copyright and plagiarism. When we talk about remix and mashups, my opinion is that, and it's not going to be a popular opinion, but I think that we're in between two models. I think, technology is changing a lot of what we do online, and I think we're in between two models, and our copyright model, our copyright system is changing, or hopefully will change. I'm a believer in Creative Commons licensing. I have a good video on my blog with Cable Green talking about Creative Commons licensing. I like to promote Creative Commons licensing. I license all of my content. I try and only use content that other people share that is licensed. In my program at my university, I teach my students to create and use and share Creative Commons licensed content. But I agree with the question earlier. A lot of the awesome tools out there that we can use to remix easily. Mozilla Popcorn is one of my favorite tools. A lot of times when I feel like when I use Mozilla Popcorn, it's a lawsuit waiting to happen. It's you're basically taking YouTube clips and remixing them. On my YouTube account, I have 3 or 4 takedown notices from Germany with videos that we remixed and we put some music in it. And so the reason why I say that the model is changing, or at least I think it is a couple of years ago when I had a video up of my son and there's a Jack Johnson song, I had takedown notices from Germany. Now I don't have any takedown notices, but there's an ad on top of my video on YouTube to buy the song from iTunes or other places. So I think online they're trying to monetize it more than anything else. I think the powerful thing is teaching our students. I'm a believer in Creative Commons, teaching them that other people created this content and they can identify their use structure for that and how they want their work to be represented and used. But it's a great question, and I think it's one that we need to have with our students. What are some of the other questions in there, Christy?
Looks like we have some good questions. And I was actually going to follow up, and I think it's also important that we point those things out to our students so that they can see in a sense that they are noticing and aware of the fact that their blog or their video now has an ad attached to it and what that actually means for them as well. So I definitely think those are things that we should be talking to students about. It seems like the consensus on the chat between the audience is that while people are favoring these more digital forms of writing, that there's also some need for more of the traditional forms of writing. And I think that, we are seeing that we want students to grow in both ways. And Jane points out, she says it's more important for students to write for the reader. And that kind of goes back to our idea of purpose. So teaching students that it's not just about writing and composing using video or creating a composition that is just traditional pen and paper. The question is, why are they doing those things? Why are they writing in that way? What is the genre? What's the purpose of that genre? Who is their audience and what are they trying to convey? Are they telling a story and doing narrative writing? Are they trying to persuade or create an argument? Are they trying to inform? And that it's really what is the purpose of the piece of writing that they're doing and what is the purpose of the audience. And that should guide their rhetorical decision making. And so as teachers, we need to think about how we have those conversations with students. How do we make sure that they are asking about that idea of purpose and audience? And then what is the best way to reach their audience? And when I work with students, those are the types of questions, or those are the types of discussions that we have. What are we doing? Who are we writing this for? And then what's the way that is going to best reach those people and to convey our ideas? And it gets kind of back again into what Ian talked about, this idea of critical literacy and trying to help them think about how knowledge is created and also how it's disseminated. And what does that actually mean then when you are not only a writer, but when you're a reader? What is that writer trying to inform you about? And so some of the things that we definitely think about. No, go ahead, Ian.
No, I love Laura's point about, there's room for both avenues. Yes, we are talking about, earlier I made the comment that the internet is the dominant text for a generation. And I definitely believe that. But in a teaching and learning space, hybrid space, face-to-face, to me, it doesn't matter. And like I said, pre-K up through higher ed, I think that our students need the opportunity to switch. They need the ability to move across text and understand purpose and audience, and then ultimate design choices when they share and when they write and when they compose. With any of this, what I tell my students is, anytime you use digital text and tools in your classroom, anytime you use the internet or other communication technologies, it should always come back to student learning objectives. Always. That we don't continue beyond that. If your use of technology will make learning better, if it will improve upon or augment the student learning objective, great. Use the digital text or tool. If it's not, if we're using technology for technology's sake, why are we doing it? And so I agree with you 100%. I think that, we need, on one level, we need our students to have the ability to move between these texts and between these spaces. They need to understand decisions and why they're moving, because yes, you can tweet, yes, you can give me a Twitter summary, 140 character summary of what we read last night. Yes, you can summarize Moby Dick into emoji. Great, that's fantastic. When you want to go get a job, when you want to apply for college, as far as right now, that skill set doesn't really help you. And so if we think about college and career readiness skills, we're not really getting our kids ready for the world outside of, when we had them for whatever time period. So I think it has to come back to student learning objectives. We have to think about, in these hybrid learning spaces, when we have our students write, there are going to be times that we want the 5-paragraph essay. There's going to be times we want the 1-page white paper. We want the resume. We want a speech. We still want the posters. I still, I shudder to think that there will be a day when, my children or Christy's children or everybody's children won't come home from school with glue on their hands, and have they built a diorama or collage. So I think we need all of these elements all in one, but let's start making room for digital text and tools.
Diane also had a really important point. She talked about the implications for tech moving to out-of-school writing, and the blurred kind of context that students are writing in. And one thing that, Ian and I are in the middle of a project that's called Walk My World, and it's on Twitter. There's also things that we've done around, and we've used poetry with that, and we've also done things around the 25-word story, which is also on Twitter, and having students take larger pieces of narrative writing and then also put it down into 25 words and share that on social media. And the purpose of that is not just to share on social media, but it's to really think about, what is the main point that you're trying to convey to that audience, that you're trying to convey to your reader. How do you take something, that is a 3-page paper and really condense it down? How do you tell a story in such a short amount of space? So we can really think about the ways that social media are used not only in students' personal lives, but when they go to the classrooms, to being effective tools. I don't like the idea of just using social media in the classroom just to use it in the classroom, and I think students kind of can see through that. I think that we need to really, again, go back to what is our instructional purposes for using this, and how does this really move students as writers to become more effective writers, to become better at conveying their ideas, to become more thoughtful writers. So I think that there are all these questions, and we have another one in terms of what is missing from online and blended K-12. Well, Ian and I had written a chapter for, and we'll have to give a link to you, for a handbook. And really what we found is when we went back through the research is that there really was not a very significant amount of research that focused on what's happening in virtual schools, and mainly completely online or blended K-12 schools. Really what we had to do was pull from the research that's been done by literacy educators, maybe in more face-to-face settings where they used digital tools and digital media, to really think about then what are the implications. So I think that Ian and I have really talked about the fact that there are a lot of implications, that we probably have more questions than we do actually answers when it comes to, what are the effective pedagogical practices in K-12 virtual schools.
And I think part of the beauty of this, I'm hunting down I put the link to the chapter in academia. I'm hunting down it's an open handbook. Rick just asked a great question, but part of the beauty of this is, at least my viewpoint on what Rick and Catherine are doing, is that they realize that there is not enough understood about what changes are happening here. So I also worked on another chapter with other colleagues, and we'll have an upcoming webinar. But my viewpoint of what we're doing here with this handbook and this work is, we're putting a stake in the ground now to say, this is where we currently stand, and this chapter, this work is ongoing. We will continuously come back and revise and iterate on it, because we're trying to figure out what this all means. So I will hunt down the link to the handbook and put it in the chat. Chris, do you want to keep moving on? Because Rick asked, what are the next steps? And we get to that later on.
Sure. So when we think about the next steps, we really start to think about, the fact that technology is in our classrooms, that it's in students' out-of-school practices, that it's really everywhere. So, what does it really mean to be effective users of, or effective readers and writers in these particular spaces? So some of the things that we started to think about was the fact that, one, just more research needs to be done, that we really need to start hearing about what teachers are doing in their classrooms and how students are learning in these environments. And to also think about the fact that, this came up a little bit before about, social media and out of school versus in school. And instead of seeing them as two separate spaces, to really think about this as more of a continuum, and to also start thinking about, what literacy practices are privileged. Why do we privilege certain reading and types of reading and writing in classrooms versus types of reading and writing outside of the classrooms? And then how do those practices kind of overlap and inform each other? So thinking about, when students are writing a blog for themselves, what are the rhetorical practices that they are doing, the rhetorical decisions that they're making, that then they can inform what they're doing in the classroom, and so that we don't see them as two just completely separate things, but we start to see this as a continuum of students writing.
I think, yeah, I wanted to, Rick had an earlier question about what do we need to know, what do we need more data on? And more to the point, he said, given the relative lack of knowledge, those of us that are on this call, and having this dialogue, how do we move forward? To me, it's pretty simple. What I would like to see is people share more. I'm a big believer in open. I'm a believer in, as I said before, Creative Commons. I mean, I think that what happens is, all of us have great work that we're doing, and we're all trying to figure out the same challenges in our own spaces. But one of the powers of the internet and open educational resources, and the power of open in general, is that there's a certain amount of serendipity involved. We can share ideas, we can connect. So what I would like to see is a couple steps for those of us that are here that want to move forward and collect data and make sense of this. Number one is document everything. Create digital copies of everything that you possibly could do and share those. So if you have all the way from worksheets and graphic organizers in your classroom to full-blown units, lesson plans, syllabi, share everything. Blog about everything, blog about, your reflections, share what you're doing and reflect in the process. So if you have graphic organizers and worksheets in your classroom and you're teaching third grade, I'm interested in those. One of the challenges that I learned coming out of the new Lit Lab at UConn is that our students have challenges synthesizing online informational text. So I want to see what you're doing as you have students synthesize, all the way up the ladder to what are students doing as they create and share. So create digital copies, share everything, have a blog where you reflect along the way and tell us what you're learning. I think all of us, and then we find a vehicle to connect all of our ideas and all of our thoughts. So that involves getting on social networks and having a little personal learning network, and having more shared discourse about some of the challenges that are occurring here.
Rick asked about, what are the ways that we should be collecting data, and Kristen brings up the fact that there is a lack of research. I think for one of the first steps is that we really need to see what is actually going on. And so we don't really know what teachers' practices are in these spaces. And so I think it could be helpful if we start start with teachers and say, what are the pedagogical practices? What are their beliefs? Why are they doing this? What's driving their instruction? What are the conceptual and the pedagogical tools that they're using? And then start to look at the effectiveness of those. And is it different than face-to-face instruction? We don't know those things yet, and so I think one of the concerns is that maybe we are teaching without really understanding the effectiveness of those pedagogical practices. So Kristen, as you're working on your doctorate, I look forward to reading about your findings and what you decide to do. And I also think we need to, again, and as Ian would say, blog on it. But I also think we need to start thinking about, what are the affordances and constraints in these particular environments? And how do we provide professional development for teachers? Once we know what they are doing, once we know what is effective, what is professional development in these contexts going to look like as well?
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge here is, I'm going to scroll back up a little bit and really mess Christy up here. So here's why we need to collect data and share and make sense of what's happening online. Back in the day, I was a doc student at the New Lit Lab. We studied online reading comprehension. We made assessments of online reading. And so back in the day, we would look at online readers and we would go to professional development, we go to workshops, we go to conferences, and we would say, well, look at this student here. They typed, what is the height of Mount Fuji in the URL bar, in the address bar. And you know what? That student is not a good online reader. That silly student, they did such a horrible job. You should have typed google.com or dogpile.com or ask.com and go to a search engine and then put your keywords there or your query there. And so back in the day, that worked. But what I've noticed over the last couple of years is because we as the user, because learners, because educators did not adapt to the technology, because we didn't become better users of the browser, of these search engines, of these digital texts and tools, the designers and the coders, they're changing the programs and the platforms to adapt to us. So now I go into Chrome and I type all my keywords. I don't go to Google. Now we see, our devices are always listening to us. Okay, my devices are, and Google is giving me answers to questions before I actually ask the question. Okay, that's, in my mind, a problem. Okay, because then we're not really being real critical consumers of online information. And then Eli Pariser will talk about the internet bubble. So the challenge is we need to provide opportunities for us to document our use of text. We need to really think deeply and critically about how we have students read and write online text, and things will always change. And that's the beauty of this. The beauty of this is that we have to have a love and also a respect for what the internet has as a tool. The same thing happens when we deal and we work in nature and we go on hikes. You have to respect nature. When we're online and reading and writing in online spaces, we have to have respect for what the internet is and what it can do and also what it cannot do. And recognize that as we're working, coders and designers are constantly changing and iterating on what we have there. So one possible way to address this, we've spent a lot of time looking at reading and writing. We looked at literacy practices in online spaces. And so one possible way to help us think better and utilize the internet and digital texts and tools in our learning spaces is work that I've been involved on for the last 2 years now on the web literacy map with Mozilla. So you see we're on version 1.5 there in that very nice, very slick looking graphic. And so we have weekly conference calls, weekly community calls. All the community calls are open. I can share links to get in. We love to have more voices. We'd love to have more people come. But we basically are trying to identify what it means for individuals, everybody. Once again, my scope is, see Rick, my scope is pre-K up through higher ed. We want to provide opportunities for individuals to be more web literate, and not just now, but in the future. So all the little tiny tykes that we work with and all the adults in higher ed that we work with, what do they need to be web literate now and in the future? Okay. So you see there are 3 columns. We basically have 3 major strands. We look at exploring, building, and connecting. So exploring, to me, is the online reading or the reading side. The building is the writing side, and then the connecting is, in my mind, the secret sauce of the internet. It's the social, the participation, in all of those components. So exploring has all the reading side of stuff that we've already talked about, but it also includes web mechanics and using the tools that we talked about in here. And it also includes security, which, in the post-Snowden era is terribly important. The building side includes one of the things that frequently starts arguments with writing teachers, and that's coding. I'm a believer that we should start teaching coding in elementary school. And remixes in there as well. And then the connecting side has collaboration and participation and privacy and open as well. And how do we share? So with the web literacy map, we are designing the strands. Each one of the competencies underneath has skills involved. And then within that, we're developing learning pathways and badges. And so Kristine knew at some point I would bring up badges in this talk. But basically, we're trying to figure out what it means to be web literate now and in the future. To make sense of that, you'll see that sophisticated series of triangles. A colleague of mine, Greg McVeary, and I, a couple of years ago, we were working with library media specialists. And library media specialists, I can see it popping up already in the chat. Library media specialists are some of my best friends. They've been doing this for decades now. They're always ahead of the curve. And so I'll share the links with the web literacy map as well. But basically what we did was we started trying to figure out, okay, how can we embed the web literacy map and those skills into what the Common Core wants us to do and the college and career readiness skills? And how can we help, regular teachers make this happen in their classroom? So we wrote up the online research and media skills curriculum. We've published on it a couple times. We've tested it. And I also have, because for some reason I had a lot of free time, I built a MOOC, a massive open online class. We've run it a couple different times. I put the link in the chat. But basically, we look at 3 skills, and these 3 skills tie directly into the web literacy map, and they scale it out. So what I did was I wanted to take all this content, and as I said before, I want you to blog and share. I decided I wanted to create this and share it with everybody. So we built a MOOC, we put it up online. I will be running the MOOC again in the beginning of April, middle of April, so if you're interested, email me. But basically, the online research and media skills model, online reading comprehension is the stuff we're working on at UConn. Online content construction is what I discussed earlier. It's students encoding and decoding digital text. And online collaborative inquiry goes right to that connecting side and the participating side. So the MOOC is there. It's all built in Google Sites. It's all Creative Commons licensed. There are videos, there are readings, there's pretty much everything under the sun. There are badges associated with it. So it's open, it's out there, it's free and available. If it interests you, get in touch with me and we can talk about how to use it. And you can also just take it and run with it. You can go start your own consulting business and run the MOOC and give out badges. But I think it's an opportunity for us to start to play with and share and test out what all this means. So I see that there's a flurry of questions as I was yammering on. So Christy, what are some of the really great questions in there?
It looks like the consensus has been, again, how do we prepare teachers for this, particularly pre-service teachers who are getting ready to go into the field? And that the consensus seems to feel like teachers aren't necessarily prepared to teach in these spaces. And I would agree that, teacher education has to kind of take a stand and also be really thoughtful in how we are preparing teachers to go into the classrooms, whether it be face-to-face or virtual or a blended space. That we really need to think about, how are we teaching teachers to think about literacy pedagogy, to think about their pedagogical tools, their conceptual tools, and then what does it, again, look like in this particular environment? And I think that is another question that is still yet to necessarily be answered. I think that we have a lot of great starts to answering that question. I think that teachers, particularly of writing, need to be writers, so they need to be writing in those spaces and understand what it is to be a writer in those spaces. Teachers also, or pre-service teachers, need to then kind of have these experiences, so they need to know what it's like to be on social media, to write blogs, and that gets back to the project Ian and I are working, Walk My World. We're working with a number of teachers and pre-service teachers to really have these conversations about how social media is used in a classroom, whether that be face-to-face or virtual.
Yeah, I agree. I think working with, that's a fantastic question, Kristen. I think, so if we think about how we do this with pre-service teachers, there's a couple layers to it. One is the reading side, the online reading side. I think we need to start to equate different forms of text in our classes. And so I think we need to start, having students in our pre-service classes read across multiple forms of text, not just having the handbook that we all read through and we all try to make sense of. There's a lot of great text out there, but start to add in, YouTube clips to our syllabus, add in, blog posts, add in, some open ed resources, start to equate that with our students and require that our students integrate those texts and that thinking into their classes. So one example is I taught last year children's literature with a colleague. And so we had students, and there was some growing pains on the part of the students and also the instructors, have students go in. We had a lesson where they would have to pick chapter books. So they would pick a book on sharks. So they go to the library and students would pick 3 books on sharks, or 3 books on the giraffe, or 3 books on a country or a state. We also wanted our students to go, we wanted our pre-service teachers to have their students go find online resources that were grade level appropriate for elementary school and acceptable for the task. And that was a challenge. So what we started doing is we used Google Custom Search Engine to have students search. We would, try and find appropriate reading materials. For the writing side, I think it's, bye Jane. I think it's important for us to find opportunities to have students write and share content and context online. So in my classes, as an icebreaker activity, I would frequently have students, do like a bio poem or introduce themselves to the class. Now I start to have them share popcorn videos and remix popcorn videos. And then the last part is we need to start opening up the doors to our classrooms. So if we're working with pre-service teachers or we're working in K-12, find ways to take a MOOC with your students during the year. You know, Kristine mentioned Walk My World. Walk My World originated because 3 or 4 of us, we all wanted to explore online content. We wanted to explore open internet spaces. And so we all basically started building a learning space, a third space, a hybrid space across our classes at our universities. So now we have learners at our individual institutions that are openly learning online and interacting online with global learners, all looking at taking a walk in each other's world using technology. So I think it's starting to make a place and make a space for technology and digital texts and tools in our classroom. I'm trying to find the web literacy, the best link, and I'll put that in there. But then I think also all of our contact info is out there. Justin, I think everybody has the contact info to get in touch with us at a later date.
Yeah, we just want to thank you for participating today and for the great questions and comments that you posted on the side during the chat. Thank you for helping us think through this issue as well.
And I apologize, we apologize for the tons of info. And please keep the conversation going. You know, you can get in touch with us on Twitter. You can get in touch. Our emails are out there. You know, basically any way that you want to get in touch with us to try and think about how to make this happen, we are more than interested. One last
thank you so much to our
go ahead. The web hashtag. If you're interested in the web literacy map, if you're interested in getting involved in that, the Teach the Web hashtag is good to follow. There are web maker clubs that are happening now. So if you're interested in getting involved and having your students write and read and remix the web and be web makers, follow the Teach the Web hashtag. Get in touch with me, and I'll get you in touch with the important people, and you can figure out how to make yourself and your students web makers and help them read and write the web.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to extend a sincere thank you to our presenters today. Such great information, such a valuable wealth of information. I know, like Ian said, this was a ton of information, but we had such a great and discussive crowd. So I want to thank both of you guys for being able to field all of those questions and address them. You guys performed incredibly admirably, so thank you for making my job a lot easier too. Just a couple things I wanted to kind of shoot out there before we did wrap up. INACOL, the Blended and Online Learning Symposium this year, November 8th through 11th, Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute has been asked to host a blended learning research community meeting as a pre-conference workshop prior to, so on November 8th. If you do have an interest in helping us shape how that meeting looks, if you have ideas for topics, please reach out to us with the contact information that I'll get to here. We also want to point you to some of our ongoing initiatives. Our podcast, we've got 3 episodes up now. We're constantly recording and posting new podcast episodes. So check out our podcast where we talk with folks around the country who are working to do more with research to shape how policy and practice looks around the area of blended and online learning. And also, if you have an interest in writing for us, check out our guest blogger program. We have an initiative there where we want to host some folks to maybe try and push out to a wider audience or a different audience. So if you have an interest in writing for us, check out that link there. We do have a webinar next week, March 18th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll hear from Carrie Rice at Boise State, Susan Lowe's at the Teachers College of Columbia, and John Watson from Evergreen Education, who also publishes the Keeping Pace reports. We'll hear from them to get a historical perspective on K-12 and online blended learning. So we're going to look at the wealth of data and research that we've collected over the past 10 years to try and see some long-term trends that we've got thus far. And for those of us who are in the audience or who might be viewing this later on, if you're going to be in attendance at McCall, the Michigan-based conference, please check out the conference program, which is linked to here. Michigan Virtual University will be presenting over a total of 8 sessions at McCall next week, March 18th through the 20th. So be sure to check us out there. Come visit us at our we'll have a stationary room there where all of our presentations will occur, and we'll also have a booth down in the exhibitor area. And in the meantime, reach out to us via email if you'd like to become part of our listserv, if you'd like to receive a weekly notification about our webinar series and our other ongoing initiatives. Reach out to us at mvlri@mivu.org. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter there, our handles. And you can check us out on LinkedIn, YouTube. Our YouTube channel is where we post the recordings of our webinars. And if you'd like to see an upcoming schedule of all of our upcoming webinars, check us out. Check out that website there at our own homepage, mvlri.org. So with that, thank you again so much to our audience who were incredibly participatory. Oh, Kristen, how many webinars have been recorded? We started doing these back in August of last year, and we've probably been at almost a once-a-week clip. So we've got quite a few. Some of them, I would say, probably over the last couple months have not yet been posted to YouTube. So we're kind of backlogged. We're working on getting those loaded up. But if you do have an interest, if you see something at our archive, which is at mvlri.org, we can actually shoot you a rough cut of the recording there because they're all recorded. So if you have any questions on the webinars themselves, please let me know. I'll put my personal email in as well. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks again to Christy and Ian, and thank you all for attending. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your Wednesday and have a great week. Take care.
Thank you.